Imagine stepping into a world where a single moment of hope can turn into a lifetime of fear. Imagine believing you are carrying new life, only to discover that the path ahead hides a darkness no woman should ever face. Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath silence, shaped by courage, betrayal, and the brutal weight of expectations. As you listen, allow yourself to feel every hesitation, every heartbeat, and every unanswered question. Across the centuries, women have carried the weight of expectations heavier than any law or decree. In many societies, a woman's worth was measured not by her voice, her dreams, or her abilities, but by her ability to bring forth life. Whether in the crowded streets of industrial cities, the quiet corners of rural villages, or the rigid households shaped by tradition, pregnancy was more than a private experience. It was a public judgment. To be with child meant hope, status, continuity, and often survival. To fail in that expectation, or even to face complications beyond one's control, meant whispers, shame, and sometimes punishment. It is within this fragile and unforgiving landscape that the story you are about to hear takes root. That in the 19th and early 20th centuries especially, medical understanding was limited, and the emotional world of women was rarely acknowledged. Families relied on midwives, rumors, and strict customs rather than knowledge or compassion. A woman might suspect she was expecting based on the faintest signs, and once the idea formed, everyone around her reacted quickly, some with joy, others with pressure, and some with fear of what a new child would mean for scarce resources. Women were often taught to remain silent about their bodies, even as they bore the risks alone. The absence of support and the presence of judgment created an environment where misunderstanding, a misdiagnosis, or a tragic circumstance could shape a fate from which there was no escape. But social expectations were only part of the burden. Marriages were frequently arranged out of necessity, and many husbands viewed their wives' pregnancies as proof of obedience or evidence of stability. A woman who could not meet those hopes risked being treated as defective, irresponsible, or morally suspect. Communities reinforced these beliefs with stories, superstitions, and unyielding traditions, making personal struggles feel like public failures. This combination of limited knowledge, rigid norms, and emotional isolation pushed countless women into impossible situations they could not predict, control, or escape. The story you will hear tonight emerges from this historical reality. It is not only about one woman's suffering, but about the entire system that shaped her choices, her fears, and the silence that surrounded her. As we move forward, listen closely to how society's expectations collide with personal vulnerability, and how one woman's hope for a child becomes the turning point in a tragedy no woman should ever have been forced to endure. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. The dim hush of a village caught between old beliefs and the slow drip of modern understanding. Her story began not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet suspicion, the kind that settles into a woman's thoughts like a whisper suggesting that her body is changing, that something unexpected and precious may be forming inside her. And as she moved through her routines, fetching water at dawn, measuring rice at midday, closing windows against the evening chill, she felt a delicate shift that she dared not speak aloud, because in her world every word carried weight, and every whisper could become a judgment. And so she kept her hope tucked deep inside, sharing it only with her racing heartbeat until the day she finally allowed herself to believe she might be expecting a child. A realization that filled her with equal parts joy, fear, and a strange, trembling uncertainty. You may have felt yourself in moments when life seems to balance on the edge of promise and danger. And as you imagine her standing there in that dimly lit kitchen, you can almost hear the rustle of her breath as she tries to steady herself, believing that perhaps this child would change everything. Believing that maybe this time love, patience, and the fragile warmth of possibility would soften the world around her. But as we move through her story together, you will see how quickly hope can turn into something else entirely. Yet the first days after her realization were filled with cautious wonder, the kind that makes ordinary tasks shimmer with new meaning. She paid attention to the way the morning light hit the doorway, how the scent of rain drifted across the fields, how her husband's footsteps sounded against the wooden floor. And though he was not cruel, he was distant, shaped by the demanding labor of his trade and the unspoken assumption that his wife's body existed to maintain the household and extend the family line. So when she thought about telling him, She hesitated, because any woman in her time knew that a pregnancy announcement did not inspire tenderness but expectation, and she feared that if she were wrong, if the signs she felt were only the echoes of exhaustion or stress, she would face the quiet disappointment that hurts more than any shouted anger. And so she waited, hoping for something unmistakable. And as she waited, the days thickened with tension, each small symptom making her wonder whether she was advancing toward motherhood or toward a mistake that could not be undone, and she confided in no one, because her village was a place where secrets traveled faster than footsteps and where older women spoke with the authority of folklore rather than medicine, and any suggestion that a woman misread her own body was treated as a personal failing. Imagine trying to navigate that landscape. Imagine the way your thoughts would circle endlessly. And that is the world she lived in. When at last she felt sure enough to tell her husband, she approached him cautiously, choosing a moment when the house was quiet, when the evening had settled low and warm, and she spoke the words in a trembling voice, watching his expression shift from surprise to a measured, thoughtful calculation. Because for him news of a child meant not celebration but responsibility. And although he nodded and offered a few gentle words, she sensed a deeper worry beneath his calm tone, as though he were trying to balance the idea of hope with the heavy demands of their uncertain future. And you can imagine how that subtle tension might have tightened something in her chest, reminding her that joy in her world could never be uncomplicated. Over the next weeks, she did everything expected of a woman carrying new life, rested when she could, avoided heavy lifting, accepted herbal mixtures from older neighbors whose advice she could not refuse, even if she doubted its usefulness. And as her routine shifted, she felt herself becoming smaller in her own life, as though the mere idea of a child had reduced her identity to a single fragile purpose, a state many modern listeners might recognize as a historical echo of ongoing pressures still present today. But then, gradually, the signs she relied on began to blur, weaken, or dissipate. What felt firm and undeniable became uncertain and inconsistent, and the small fluttering sensations she thought she felt vanished into the quiet of her body, leaving her with a creeping dread she tried desperately to ignore, because to admit that something was wrong would mean not only losing hope but facing the crushing scrutiny of those who believed that a woman's body could fail only through her own fault. And as nights passed with her lying awake, listening to the distant calls of nocturnal birds, she wondered whether she had misread every sign, whether her hope had tricked her, whether the pressure to fulfill the role expected of her had pushed her into believing in a future that was never there. And this internal battle, between what she felt, what she feared, and what she wished for, grew heavier until one cold morning she realized something was terribly, unmistakably wrong, though she could not name it. Still, she kept moving, pretending nothing had changed, because the alternative meant collapsing under the weight of a truth she could not yet face. And as you imagine her navigating those days, each step carrying the burden of doubt, you may feel the quiet dread that seeped into her life long before anyone else recognized it, setting the stage for the fate she would soon confront, a fate no woman should ever have been forced to endure. In those tense days that followed, she found herself drifting through her chores as if moving underwater, each movement slow and shadowed by the dread she could not confess, and though she tried to maintain the outward calm expected of her, the quiet tremors of fear pulsed through her thoughts, making her wonder whether his silence was protecting her or slowly undoing her. And as she glanced at the women around her, neighbors certain about how pregnancy should unfold, she felt the sting of comparison tightening around her chest, for they would have announced their condition boldly by now, while she felt trapped by a secret that no longer felt like hope. With each dawn, her body spoke in contradictions, moments of heaviness followed by eerie stillness, waves of nausea replaced by unsettling clarity, and she sensed that whatever had begun inside her had shifted in ways she did not understand. Yet she feared that speaking it aloud would invite accusations of carelessness, for in her village misfortune and blame walked hand in hand. Her husband noticed her distancing herself, though he misunderstood it as mere fatigue, offering practical suggestions rather than the questions she wished he would ask, and the emotional gap widened until she felt utterly alone, walking through her home like a visitor afraid to disturb the quiet. One evening, as the sky dimmed into fading gold, she rested her hand on her abdomen and begged her body for clarity. But nothing came except a hollow ache settling deep in her bones, a warning she could not interpret. She tried to steady herself each morning, hoping for a sign that would break the uncertainty, but each day only deepened her confusion. Finally, and it was during those tense, breathless hours of waiting, that her world began slipping into a darkness deeper than she had imagined, because the strange stillness in her body grew heavier, pressing against her thoughts until she could no longer pretend that everything was normal. And though she wanted to run to someone, anyone, she knew that seeking help meant exposing herself to the harsh scrutiny of a community that believed a woman's suffering was either divine punishment or personal failure. So she hid her fear and walked through each day with a fragile mask of endurance, hoping her body would somehow correct itself, hoping fate would show mercy, even as her instincts warned her otherwise. And as you picture her moving through these days, remember how isolation magnifies every fear, how silence can turn uncertainty into terror. And that is precisely what began to unravel inside her. For each night she lay awake, hearing the echo of her own heartbeat pounding like a clock, counting down toward an unknown catastrophe. She tried to maintain her chores, though every step seemed heavier than the last, and when her husband asked whether she was feeling better, she forced a smile, telling him she only needed rest, because the truth felt too dangerous to share, and she feared that even he, who had never raised his voice at her, would react with disappointment or suspicion if he learned that the child they had begun quietly imagining might no longer be alive, or worse, might never have existed in the way they hoped. And so she swallowed her dread, convincing herself that tomorrow would bring clarity, though each tomorrow only deepened her confusion and hollowed her spirit. Meanwhile, the village women continued offering advice based on old tales rather than knowledge, insisting that if she prayed harder, ate certain herbs, or performed small rituals meant to strengthen life, everything would resolve itself. And she nodded politely, though she felt something tightening inside her, something her instincts knew was not the result of weak prayer or forgotten rituals, but something far more dangerous. Still, she followed their guidance because refusing would attract questions she did not want to answer. As days passed, her abdomen, once full of subtle tension, felt strangely light, almost empty. And though she tried pressing her palm against it, hoping to feel even the faintest reassurance, there was nothing but silence, a silence that filled her with shame, because she feared what others would say, that she had failed her husband, that she had misread her body, that she had spoken too soon, or that she had somehow brought misfortune upon herself. The cruelest part was that she did not know whether she was mourning the loss of a child or the loss of a dream, and the ambiguity was unbearable. One cold morning she woke with a sharp pain tearing across her side, a violent warning that forced her to hunch forward until her vision blurred, and she clutched the edge of her bedding, gasping as she realized this was no ordinary discomfort. Something inside her was collapsing, unraveling, or breaking, and for the first time she felt the terrifying certainty that she needed help. But where could she go? The local healer was known for blaming women for their own suffering, and the nearest town doctor was too far for someone weakened by fear and pain to reach alone, yet she knew that remaining silent would endanger her more than judgment ever could. So she forced herself to rise, gripping the wall as she steadied her trembling legs, and as she stepped into the main room, her husband looked up and immediately sensed her distress, his face shifting from confusion to alarm as she struggled to speak. She finally confessed her fear, her suspicion that something was terribly wrong, and though her voice trembled, she pushed herself to describe the strange silence inside her, the vanishing signs, the growing pain, and the dread haunting her thoughts. And while her husband was initially stunned, he did not hesitate. He helped her sit, fetched water, and prepared to take her to the healer. But she shook her head, insisting she needed real treatment, not herbs, not charms, not whispered superstitions, but someone with knowledge of the body and its dangers. Her husband hesitated only a moment before agreeing to take her to the distant town doctor, a decision that meant facing suspicion from neighbors who believed medical intervention was a sign of weakness or mistrust in tradition, but he no longer cared about their opinions. Her pale face and trembling hands scared him more than judgment ever could. The journey was long and grueling, each jolt of the road sending sharp shocks through her abdomen, but she clung to hope that the doctor would provide answers, that someone would finally see her suffering without blaming her for it. When they reached the town clinic, the doctor examined her with a seriousness that sent cold fear through her veins, and after a long silence he explained what her body had been trying to tell her. The pregnancy had not progressed normally, and what she had experienced was likely a form of false pregnancy or an early loss that occurred before her body fully recognized it, a condition not rare but rarely understood in her world, and her continued symptoms meant she was now at risk of infection, internal damage, or worse if she did not receive immediate care. As the doctor spoke, she felt the room tilt, not from shock but from the devastating validation of her deepest fear. She had never been safe, not from her expectations, not from her community, not from her silence, and not even from her own body's betrayal. And though the doctor reassured her that this was not her fault, she knew returning home meant facing a different verdict. Still, she followed his instructions, endured the painful treatment, and clung to the small, fragile hope that she might still recover. But deep inside she sensed that her ordeal was only beginning, because even if her body healed, the world she returned to would not understand what she had endured, and the judgment waiting for her would cut deeper than any physical wound. And as you imagine her leaving that clinic, exhausted, shaken, and forever changed, you can feel the heavy shift in her fate, the way a single moment of hope had unraveled into a tragedy shaped not only by her body but by the society that refused to understand it, drawing her toward a fate no woman should ever have been forced to face. When she returned to the village, the air felt colder, as though the place itself sensed that she carried home something heavier than illness, something unspoken and unsettling. And though her husband helped her into their house with a gentleness he had never shown before, she could feel the weight of curious eyes watching from doorways, whispers forming even before she crossed the threshold, because in a community shaped by tradition, a woman leaving for outside treatment was already suspicious, but returning looking drained, pale, and hollow invited even harsher speculation. And she knew it was only a matter of time before the rumors began carving away what little strength she had left. In the first days following her return, she tried to rest as the doctor instructed, drinking the bitter medicine he had provided, lying still when the exhaustion overwhelmed her. But her peace was fragile, easily broken by the sound of neighbors visiting under the pretense of concern, their questions sharp beneath their polite smiles, their glances drifting to her abdomen as if searching for evidence of failure. And though she tried to answer simply, avoiding details that would only feed more gossip, she could see in their eyes that they had already decided her story for her, imagining sins or mistakes she had never committed, and each visit drained her until she dreaded the sound of footsteps near her door. Even her husband, who had stood by her through the worst moments at the clinic, could not stop the slow tightening of pressure around them. He tried to reassure her, telling her that recovery was all that mattered, but she could sense his unease when neighbors spoke to him outside, offering unsolicited advice or cryptic warnings about women whose bodies rejected life, as though her suffering were an omen rather than a medical condition. And though he tried to dismiss their words, she knew the shame began to seep into him as well, not because he blamed her, but because he feared what the village would think of their household. As the days passed, her physical pain eased, but the emotional wounds grew sharper, fueled by the relentless murmur of voices questioning whether she had ever been pregnant at all, whether she had deceived her husband, whether she sought the doctor only to hide wrongdoing. And though these accusations were baseless, they spread quickly, shaping how people looked at her, how they lowered their voices when she walked by, how they paused conversations until she had passed, and the constant isolation chipped away at her sense of self until she felt like a shadow lingering on the edges of her own life. She found herself avoiding the market, taking the long path around the fields to collect water, waiting until dusk to perform chores outside, hoping the darkness would hide her from prying eyes. But even then she felt exposed, as though the village itself breathed judgment with every shifting breeze, and she wondered whether healing was even possible in a place that refused to understand the truth. Her husband, growing tired of the whispers, suggested they spend more time indoors, but hiding only deepened her despair, making their home feel like a quiet cage. And on more than one occasion she found herself sitting alone in the dim light, tracing the faint outline of where she once believed life had begun, grieving a dream she could not fully name. And as she sat with that grief, she realized that the pain she carried now was far more complex than the loss itself. It was the pain of being unheard, misunderstood, reduced to a story shaped by others, and this silent suffering began to consume her, blurring the edges of each day until time felt like an endless loop of waiting for a forgiveness she had no reason to seek. Weeks turned into months, and though the physical traces of her ordeal faded, the emotional marks remained, appearing in the way she startled at sudden noises, the way she hesitated before speaking, the way she clung to small routines as if they could anchor her in a world that no longer felt safe. And though her husband tried to help, even he could not shield her from the quiet cruelty of a community that refused to accept ambiguity. For in their world a woman's body was supposed to function with predictable certainty, and anything outside that narrow script was treated as a moral flaw rather than a medical reality. In time, she began withdrawing even from him, not out of resentment but out of exhaustion, feeling that explaining her emotions would burden him further, and so she kept her turmoil silent, carrying it like a hidden bruise that deepened each time she was reminded of what she had lost, not only the possibility of a child but the sense of belonging she once had. And as you imagine her moving through those days, consider how many women across history endured similar fates, trapped between their bodies, their societies, and the expectations imposed upon them, their stories silenced not by force but by the crushing weight of misunderstanding, and you may recognize echoes of struggles that persist even now, in places where women still face scrutiny for the natural unpredictability of their own biology. Over time, she learned to navigate the village with a quiet resilience, accepting that the whispers might never dissipate, but she refused to let them define her completely, slowly reclaiming pieces of herself through small acts of defiance, walking through the central market despite the stares, tending her garden with steady hands, helping neighbors despite knowing they once doubted her. And through these actions she began carving out a fragile strength that could not be taken from her. Yet even as she rebuilt herself, she remained acutely aware of the fragility of that strength, knowing that her fate had been shaped not just by her own suffering but by a system that left no room for vulnerability, a system that punished silence yet punished honesty even more. And though she survived, she never forgot the moment when hope transformed into fear, when her body's quiet betrayal intertwined with the harsh expectations of others, creating a fate no woman should ever have been forced to endure. And in that understanding, her story lingers, not as a tale of weakness but as a testament to the quiet endurance countless women before and after her have carried in the face of judgment, silence, and impossible expectations, a reminder that even unspoken pain demands recognition. Her story, though shaped by a distant time and an unforgiving community, reflects a truth that continues to echo across generations, that a woman's body, her hopes, and her fears have too often been weighed against expectations she did not choose. As we look back on her journey, we see more than the medical misunderstanding that changed her fate. We see the devastating consequences of silence, judgment, and the absence of compassion. She endured a loss she could barely name and returned to a world unwilling to understand her pain. Yet she found the strength to rebuild her life piece by fragile piece. That resilience is not born from ease but from necessity, the kind of endurance countless women throughout history have carried in the shadows of their own struggles. When we reflect on stories like Hayes, we are reminded that progress is not simply measured by medical advances but by the willingness of societies to listen, to understand, and to hold space for the complexities of human experience. Her suffering was shaped not only by what happened within her body but by the way her world responded, or failed to respond, to her vulnerability. And while her life moved forward, her experience left a mark, a quiet warning about the dangers of assumptions, the harm caused by whispered judgments, and the deep emotional toll of being misunderstood in a moment of profound personal crisis. As you step back from her story tonight, consider how many similar voices remain unheard, how many women have faced their own fear and confusion with no support, and how easily a moment of hope can become a burden when compassion is absent. If her story moves you, let it serve as a reminder that empathy is more than softness. It is protection against the kind of fate she endured, a fate no woman should ever face again. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see.